Under gray Atlantic skies in 1720, a crowd gathered along the muddy banks of the Thames, their voices rising in anticipation as the silver oar of the High Court of Admiralty gleamed in the morning light. This ceremonial weapon, carried at the head of every pirate execution procession, signaled that justice was about to be served in the most brutal fashion imaginable. But on this particular day, something was different. Among the condemned walking their final steps to the gallows were two figures whose presence would challenge everything society believed about women, crime, and the very nature of justice itself. The execution of female pirates represents one of the most disturbing yet fascinating chapters in maritime history, revealing a world where gender, violence, and the law intersected in ways that would shock and horrify even the most hardened observers. These women, who dared to defy every social convention of their time, faced a justice system specifically designed to make examples of those who threatened the established order. Their stories, preserved in court records and witness testimonies, expose the dark machinery of 18th century criminal justice and the particular cruelties reserved for women who stepped outside their prescribed roles. What made the execution of female pirates so uniquely terrifying was not just the brutality of the punishment itself, but the elaborate theater of humiliation and terror that preceded it. The legal framework governing pirate executions had been carefully crafted over centuries to maximize both the physical suffering of the condemned and the psychological impact on those who witnessed their deaths. Pirates were classified under maritime law as hostis humanis generis, enemies of all mankind, a designation that placed them outside the normal protections of legal procedure and made their guilt essentially predetermined before they ever set foot in a courtroom. The journey to the gallows began long before the condemned reached execution dock. Female pirates, like their male counterparts, were held in the fetid dungeons of Marshalsea Prison or similar facilities, where the conditions themselves often proved fatal. These prisons were breeding grounds for disease, overcrowded and poorly ventilated spaces where inmates fought over scraps of food and basic necessities. For women, the dangers extended beyond mere physical discomfort. Female prisoners faced additional vulnerabilities, including sexual assault and exploitation by guards and fellow inmates, creating layers of trauma that began long before their final punishment. The legal proceedings that condemned these women followed a ritualized pattern designed to ensure swift convictions with minimal regard for actual evidence or due process. The High Court of Admiralty operated under different rules than common law courts, and defendants had no right to legal representation. The burden of proof was deliberately minimal, as the court considered the mere presence aboard a pirate vessel sufficient evidence of willing participation in piracy. Witnesses were brought forward to testify against the accused, but these testimonies often relied on hearsay, personal vendettas, or coerced statements from other captured pirates seeking to save their own lives. When female pirates did appear before these courts, their gender created unique complications for both prosecutors and judges. The legal system of the early 18th century struggled to reconcile the reality of violent criminal women with prevailing beliefs about feminine nature and capability. Court records reveal the particular attention paid to descriptions of these women's appearance and behavior, as if their physical presentation could somehow explain their transgression into masculine criminality. Witnesses were asked detailed questions about whether the defendants had dressed as men, how they had spoken and carried themselves, and whether they had participated directly in acts of violence. The most notorious case of female pirates facing execution began with the capture of Anne Bonny and Mary Read in October 1720. These two women had sailed with the infamous Captain John Rackham, known as Calico Jack, conducting raids throughout the Caribbean until their capture by pirate hunter Jonathan Barnett near the coast of Jamaica. Their subsequent trial would become one of the most publicized criminal proceedings of its era, drawing attention not only for the defendant's gender but for the shocking testimony about their participation in acts of piracy. The witnesses who testified against Bonnie and Reed painted a picture of women who had fully embraced the violent lifestyle of piracy. Dorothy Thomas, one of the victims who testified at their trial, described seeing both women dressed in men's clothing, carrying weapons, and actively participating in the robbery and terrorizing of captured vessels. She noted that she knew they were women only from the size of their breasts, as they had otherwise completely adopted masculine dress and behavior. This testimony was crucial for the prosecution, as it established that these were not merely passengers or unwilling participants, but active members of the pirate crew. The trial itself took place on November 28, 1720 in Spanish Town, Jamaica, before a court of vice admiralty. The proceedings followed the standard pattern for pirate trials, with the silver oar prominently displayed to symbolize the court's authority over maritime crimes. The defendants were not permitted legal counsel and had little opportunity to present evidence in their defense. The witnesses testified to their participation in multiple acts of piracy, describing scenes of violence and robbery that shocked the packed courtroom. What made this trial particularly significant was not just the gender of the defendants, but the way their case highlighted the contradictions and complexities within the legal system's treatment of women. The same society that viewed women as inherently weaker and less capable of violence was now confronted with evidence of their direct participation in some of the most brutal crimes of the era. The court records reveal the struggle to reconcile these competing narratives, with prosecutors emphasizing the defendants' masculine dress and behavior as evidence of their corruption and abandonment of proper feminine roles. The verdict was never in doubt. Both women were found guilty by unanimous vote and sentenced to death by hanging, the standard punishment for piracy. However, their gender would provide them with an unexpected reprieve that revealed another layer of complexity in the justice system's treatment of female criminals. As the judge pronounced their death sentences, both Bonnie and Reed employed a legal strategy known as pleading their bellies, claiming to be pregnant and therefore entitled to a stay of execution until after they gave birth. This legal mechanism, recognized under English law, reflected the period's concern for protecting unborn children even when their mothers had been condemned to death. A jury of matrons, experienced women appointed by the court, would examine the defendants to verify their claims of pregnancy. If confirmed, the execution would be postponed until after the birth, though the death sentence would remain in effect. This practice created a bizarre situation where condemned women could gain months or even years of additional life through pregnancy, real or claimed. The psychological impact of this legal limbo cannot be understated. These women faced the constant knowledge that their reprieve was temporary, that they were living on borrowed time that would end with the birth of their children. The emotional toll of carrying a child while under sentence of death, knowing that motherhood would ultimately lead to execution, represents one of the most cruel aspects of the period's justice system. The examination process itself became another form of psychological torture, as condemned women were subjected to intimate physical inspection by strangers while facing the knowledge that confirmation of their pregnancy merely delayed, rather than prevented, their eventual execution. The jury of matrons would conduct their examination in the prison, often under the watchful eyes of guards and court officials, stripping away any remaining dignity from women who had already been reduced to objects of public spectacle. Mary Red's pregnancy was confirmed, granting her the temporary reprieve that would ultimately prove meaningless. The conditions in Jamaican colonial prisons during the early 18th century were notoriously harsh, with inadequate food, poor sanitation, and rampant disease creating an environment where survival itself became a daily struggle. For a pregnant woman, these conditions posed additional dangers that often proved as fatal as the hangman's noose. Prison records from the period reveal the systematic neglect that characterized the treatment of condemned prisoners. Women received the same meager rations as men despite their increased nutritional needs during pregnancy, and medical care was virtually non-existent. The stone walls of these tropical prisons trapped heat during the day and offered no protection from the dampness that crept in during the night, creating conditions that weakened even the strongest constitution. Reed's death in April 1721, just months after her reprieve, illustrates the cruel irony of the legal system's supposed mercy. Her burial was recorded at St. Catherine's Church in Jamaica, but there is no record of a child's burial, suggesting that she may have died in childbirth or that both mother and child perished together. The parish records list her simply as Mary Reed, pirate, a stark reminder that even in death, her criminal identity overshadowed any consideration of her humanity. Anne Bonny's fate remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, with no definitive record of her execution or release. Some historians suggest that her family's wealth and connections may have secured her freedom, while others believe she died in prison under circumstances similar to Reed's. The absence of clear documentation reflects the broader pattern of how the legal system treated female criminals as disposable curiosities rather than human beings deserving of basic record-keeping. The execution ritual itself, when it did occur, represented the culmination of months or years of psychological torment designed to break the condemned both mentally and spiritually. The procession from prison to execution dock followed a carefully choreographed route through the streets of London or other port cities, allowing maximum public exposure and humiliation. The silver oar of the Admiralty led this grim parade, its polished surface reflecting the faces of curious onlookers who gathered to witness what many viewed as entertainment. Female pirates who reached the gallows faced unique forms of degradation that reflected society's particular horror at women who had embraced violence and criminality. Contemporary accounts describe how crowds would focus obsessively on these women's appearance, commenting on their dress, their demeanor, and their final words with a prurient interest that revealed deep anxieties about gender and social order. The condemned were expected to perform repentance and femininity in their final moments, even as they faced death for having rejected those very qualities. The gallows at execution dock were deliberately constructed to maximize suffering rather than provide a quick death. Unlike the long drop method that would later break the condemned's neck instantly, pirate executions employed short ropes that caused death by slow strangulation. This process, known grimly as the Marshal's Dance for the way bodies would convulse and writhe, could take up to 45 minutes of agonizing consciousness before death finally occurred. For female pirates, this prolonged dying became another form of public spectacle, as crowds gathered to watch their final struggles while vendors sold food and drink to the assembled masses. The execution became a carnival atmosphere that transformed human suffering into popular entertainment, reflecting the period's casual brutality and the dehumanization of those who challenged social norms. The bodies of executed pirates were not permitted the dignity of immediate burial. Maritime law required that corpses remain hanging until 3 tides had washed over their heads, a symbolic cleansing that was supposed to purify the contaminated waters where their crimes had occurred. For particularly notorious pirates, this period could extend for years, with bodies displayed in iron cages called gibbets that allowed for gradual decomposition in full view of passing ships. This practice of displaying corpses served multiple purposes within the broader campaign to eliminate piracy through terror. Ship captains and crews passing these gruesome landmarks were reminded of the fate that awaited those who turned to piracy, while the gradual decay of the bodies provided a visceral demonstration of the state's power to reach beyond death itself. The sight of these rotting remains, with their tattered clothing and empty eye sockets, became part of the psychological landscape of maritime commerce. Women's bodies subjected to this treatment faced particular degradation, as their exposure challenged fundamental notions of feminine modesty and dignity. Contemporary observers noted the shock of seeing female corpses displayed alongside men, describing the scene as an affront to natural order that somehow made the punishment more disturbing than the crimes that had preceded it. These reactions reveal how deeply the execution of female pirates unsettled social hierarchies that extended far beyond questions of crime and punishment. The legal precedents established by these cases would influence the treatment of female criminals for generations to come. The principle that women could plead their bellies to escape immediate execution became a recognized defense strategy, though one that often merely postponed rather than prevented death sentences. This legal loophole created perverse incentives within the prison system, where condemned women might deliberately seek pregnancy as their only means of survival. Rachel Wall's case in Massachusetts represents the evolution of these practices in the New World, where colonial courts adapted English maritime law to local circumstances while maintaining the same essential brutality. Her execution in 1789 came at a time when the young United States was grappling with questions of justice and punishment. Yet her treatment differed little from that of her predecessors in British colonial courts decades earlier. Wall's journey to the gallows began with her capture after attempting to rob Margaret Bender of her bonnet, a crime that seems almost trivial compared to the acts of piracy that had defined her earlier life. Yet the Massachusetts court chose to try her for highway robbery rather than piracy, suggesting that colonial authorities were more concerned with protecting property than pursuing maritime justice. The death sentence for what would later be considered a minor crime reflects the period's harsh approach to any challenge to the established order. The circumstances surrounding Wall's final days reveal the particular cruelties that colonial American society reserved for women who had transgressed beyond redemption. Unlike her British counterparts who might languish for months in fetid dungeons, Wall faced a swifter but no less brutal conclusion to her story. The Massachusetts authorities, eager to demonstrate their commitment to law and order in the fragile new republic, scheduled her execution for October 8, 1789, giving her less than a month to prepare for death. Prison records from this period describe the stark conditions that condemned prisoners endured while awaiting execution. Wall was held in a small stone cell with minimal furnishing, receiving visits only from clergy members who sought to extract confessions and expressions of repentance that could be used to justify her punishment to the public. These sessions became exercises in psychological manipulation, as religious authorities pressed her to acknowledge not only her crimes, but her fundamental corruption as a woman who had abandoned her proper role in society. The Boston newspapers of the time covered Wall's case with a mixture of fascination and moral condemnation that reflected the broader cultural anxiety about women's capacity for violence. Articles described her past exploits with a sensationalized tone that transformed her criminal activities into cautionary tales about the dangers of female independence. The press painted her as a cautionary example of what happened when women rejected domestic roles and ventured into masculine spheres of activity. What emerges from these contemporary accounts is a portrait of a justice system struggling to reconcile its treatment of female criminals with prevailing notions of feminine nature. The Massachusetts court that condemned Wall to death grappled with the same contradictions that had plagued earlier cases involving Anne Bonny and Mary Read. How could society explain women who seemed to embrace violence and criminality with the same enthusiasm as their male counterparts? The answer, reflected in court records and newspaper coverage, lay in portraying these women as fundamentally corrupted beings who had abandoned their essential feminine nature. The execution itself took place at the traditional site used for such purposes, a location chosen for maximum public visibility and deterrent effect. Contemporary accounts describe crowds gathering from across the region to witness what many viewed as a unique spectacle. The presence of a woman on the gallows drew particular attention, with observers noting every detail of her appearance and demeanor for later retelling. These descriptions reveal the voyeuristic fascination that surrounded female executions, transforming human suffering into public entertainment. Wall's final words, carefully recorded by court officials and later published in broadsides sold throughout New England, followed the expected pattern of repentance and moral instruction. She acknowledged her crimes while warning others against following her path, performing the role of the penitent sinner that society demanded from condemned criminals. Yet beneath this ritualized confession lay hints of the defiance that had characterized her earlier life, subtle indications that her submission to authority remained incomplete even in the face of death. The hanging itself proceeded according to the established protocol that had been refined through decades of public executions. The short rope ensured a slow death by strangulation rather than the quick neck break that might have provided mercy, transforming her final moments into an extended performance of state power. Contemporary witnesses described the crowd's reaction as a mixture of fascination and horror, with many commenting on the particular disturbing quality of watching a woman die in such circumstances. The aftermath of Wall's execution reveals how these events functioned within the broader social and political context of the early American Republic. Her death was used by authorities and moralists as evidence of the new nation's commitment to law and order, proof that American justice would show no favoritism based on gender or social position. Yet the case also exposed the arbitrary nature of colonial criminal justice, where the difference between life and death often depended more on timing and circumstance than on the actual severity of crimes committed. The psychological impact on those who witnessed these executions extended far beyond the immediate spectacle of death. Survivors' accounts from the period describe the lasting trauma experienced by observers, particularly women and children who attended these events as part of their moral education. The sight of female bodies subjected to public execution challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, violence, and social order in ways that continued to disturb witnesses long after the crowds had dispersed. The documentation of these cases provides crucial insights into how societies use punishment not merely to address individual crimes, but to reinforce broader systems of power and control. The elaborate rituals surrounding female pirate executions served multiple functions simultaneously. They eliminated specific threats to maritime commerce, deterred potential future criminals, and demonstrated the consequences of challenging established gender roles and social hierarchies. The medical knowledge of the period added another layer of cruelty to these proceedings, as officials understood enough about human anatomy to deliberately prolong suffering while lacking the knowledge or inclination to provide any form of pain relief. Contemporary medical texts describe the process of death by hanging in clinical terms that reveal both the era's growing scientific understanding and its callous application of that knowledge to maximize punishment. Prison physicians who attended condemned criminals in their final days left records that exposed the systematic dehumanization that characterized the treatment of female pirates and other criminals. These medical accounts describe their subjects not as suffering human beings but as objects of scientific curiosity, specimens whose impending deaths provided opportunities for observation and study. The intersection of medical knowledge and criminal justice created a particularly cold form of cruelty that treated human suffering as a resource to be exploited for educational purposes. The financial aspects of these executions reveal another dimension of how society transformed human misery into economic opportunity. The sale of broadsides containing confessions and final speeches generated revenue for printers and distributors, while vendors at execution sites profited from selling food, drink, and souvenirs to the assembled crowds. The condemned criminals themselves became commodities in this economy of death, their stories packaged and sold to satisfy public curiosity about crime and punishment. The international context of these cases demonstrates how the execution of female pirates reflected broader patterns of colonial expansion and maritime commerce protection. The British Empire's campaign against piracy was driven not by abstract notions of justice, but by the practical need to secure trade routes and protect merchant investments. Female pirates threatened this economic system just as directly as their male counterparts, and their punishment served the same fundamental purpose of safeguarding commercial interests through terror and deterrence. The legal innovations that emerged from these cases would influence criminal justice practices for generations. The precedent that pregnancy could delay but not prevent execution created a complex set of legal procedures that courts continued to grapple with well into the 19th century. This principle reflected the period's complicated relationship with concepts of mercy and justice, acknowledging the value of unborn life while maintaining the state's ultimate authority over life and death. The religious dimensions of these executions reveal how spiritual authorities collaborated with secular courts to legitimize and sanctify the process of judicial killing. Clergy members who attended condemned prisoners served multiple roles as counselors, confessors, and propagandists, helping to transform brutal punishments into moral lessons for public consumption. Their presence at executions provided a veneer of spiritual authority that helped justify the systematic taking of human life in the name of social order. The architectural elements of execution sites were carefully designed to maximize both practical efficiency and symbolic impact. The gallows at Execution Dock and similar locations incorporated features that enhanced visibility for spectators, while ensuring that the condemned could not escape their fate. The placement of these structures near water served both practical purposes, allowing for the disposal of bodies according to maritime law, and symbolic ones connecting the punishment directly to the maritime crimes that had brought the condemned to their final destination. The social hierarchies that governed access to these executions reveal how criminal justice functioned as a form of public entertainment that reinforced class distinctions and social boundaries. Wealthy observers could purchase premium viewing positions while common people crowded into general areas, creating a microcosm of broader social stratification even in the context of witnessing death. These arrangements ensured that the lessons of punishment were delivered not only to potential criminals but to all levels of society according to their proper stations. The international network of communication that spread news of these executions demonstrates how colonial authorities used punishment as a form of propaganda designed to influence behavior across vast geographical distances. Reports of female pirate executions traveled along trade routes and through diplomatic channels, carrying warnings to potential criminals while reassuring merchant interests that their investments were being protected through vigorous law enforcement. The psychological studies that emerged from observing condemned criminals in their final days contributed to evolving understanding of human behavior under extreme stress. These observations, recorded by prison officials and visiting scholars, provided insights into how individuals responded to the certainty of impending death, while revealing the callous scientific curiosity that characterized much of the era's approach to human suffering. The technological innovations that improved the efficiency of executions reflected the period's broader embrace of rationalization and systematization in all areas of human activity. The refinement of hanging techniques, the standardization of legal procedures, and the optimization of crowd control measures all demonstrated how societies applied emerging principles of organization and efficiency to the business of taking human life. The transformation of maritime law during this period reflected broader changes in how European powers understood sovereignty and territorial control. The distinction between crimes committed on land and those perpetrated at sea had evolved over centuries, creating a complex web of jurisdictions that courts manipulated to ensure maximum punishment for those who threatened commercial interests. Female pirates found themselves caught within this legal labyrinth, where their gender provided no protection from the harsh realities of admiralty justice. The economic incentives driving these prosecutions extended beyond simple deterrence to encompass the systematic seizure of assets and property from condemned criminals. Courts routinely confiscated everything owned by convicted pirates, from personal belongings to shares in legitimate businesses, redistributing this wealth among officials and informants who had contributed to their capture. Women who had accumulated property through marriage or inheritance discovered that their criminal convictions voided all previous legal protections, leaving their families destitute while enriching the very system that had condemned them. The training and selection of executioners for these maritime punishments required specialized knowledge that distinguished them from their counterparts who handled common criminal cases. These men understood the particular techniques needed to ensure that death by hanging occurred through slow strangulation rather than quick neck breaks, and they possessed the psychological fortitude necessary to maintain the theatrical elements that made these executions effective as public spectacles. Their expertise commanded premium wages, reflecting the specialized nature of their grim profession. The impact on maritime communities extended far beyond the immediate deterrent effects that authorities intended. Families of executed female pirates faced lasting social stigma that affected their ability to secure employment, arrange marriages, or participate fully in community life. Children discovered that their mothers' criminal reputations followed them throughout their lives, creating generational consequences that perpetuated cycles of poverty and social exclusion. These ripple effects demonstrate how punishment functioned as a mechanism of social control that reached far beyond the individuals who faced execution. The development of prison conditions specifically designed for condemned female pirates reveals the intersection of gender-based assumptions with practical considerations of security and control. Authorities struggled to balance their desire to maintain traditional gender roles with the reality that these women had proven themselves capable of extreme violence. The result was a hybrid system that subjected female prisoners to additional indignities while maintaining the same basic brutality that characterized the treatment of all condemned pirates. The documentation practices that preserved records of these cases reflect the bureaucratic mentality that characterized colonial administration during this period. Court clerks meticulously recorded not only the basic facts of trials and executions, but also details appearance, behavior, and final statements and observations about the condemned women. These records served multiple purposes, providing evidence for appeals to higher authorities while creating archives that could be consulted for precedent in future cases involving similar crimes. The international diplomatic implications of pirate executions created complex negotiations between colonial authorities and European powers who claimed jurisdiction over various Caribbean territories. Female pirates who had operated across multiple colonial boundaries found themselves subject to competing legal claims that often resulted in prolonged imprisonment, while authorities determined which court had the strongest case for prosecution. These jurisdictional disputes sometimes saved lives by creating delays, but more often they simply extended the psychological torture of awaiting execution while legal authorities haggled over the right to impose death sentences. The technological advances in ship design and navigation that characterized the early 18th century paradoxically made both piracy and anti-piracy efforts more effective. Faster ships allowed pirates to strike quickly and escape before authorities could respond, but they also enabled naval patrols to cover larger areas and pursue suspected criminals across greater distances. Female pirates benefited from these innovations during their criminal careers, but ultimately fell victim to the same technological progress that made their capture and prosecution more likely. The role of informants and betrayers in securing convictions against female pirates reveals the corrosive effects that fear and financial incentives had on maritime communities. Former crew members who agreed to testify against their companions often received pardons or reduced sentences, creating powerful incentives for betrayal that undermined the solidarity that had once characterized pirate crews. Women who had trusted male companions with their lives discovered that gender provided no protection against betrayal when survival was at stake. Today, the stories of Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Rachel Wall, and countless unnamed women who faced the gallows remind us that history's darkest chapters often reveal the most about the societies that created them. These women challenged every assumption about gender, crime, and justice in their time, paying the ultimate price for defying a world that demanded their submission. Their executions were not merely punishments, but elaborate performances designed to reinforce social order through terror and spectacle. We remember them not to glorify their crimes, but to understand how systems of power have always used the most vulnerable as examples for others. Their voices, preserved in court records and witness testimonies, continue to speak across the centuries, demanding that we never forget the human cost of unchecked authority and the dangers of treating any group as disposable enemies of mankind.